Is that an opportunity then? Can we come back to green light? Because nowhere near enough people are talking about this thing.
Yeah, please give us an overview.
I started looking at papers on light. I'm getting curious, vitamin D, light environment, that kind of thing. And I think probably Google figured it out that, this guy's curious about this or something. In any case, a paper showed up that I didn't ask for, but Google Scholar Alert or something sent it to me, and it was on green light and headaches. Maybe they were listening to my phone, because this has happened to me before. I'm having a conversation with the AJK and we say something, she says it in Spanish, and I start getting cat food commercials in Spanish language because Google listens to my phone and I haven't shut that thing off. So maybe it was because I'm talking about migraine headaches. She suffers from them. This paper shows up. Green light relieves the pain of migraines. There was a study at Harvard University in these active migraineurs, and it was on photosensitivity. They wanted to understand why the people with migraine headaches are so sensitive to light. And they tested all the individual wavelengths in the visible spectrum. Every single one of them made the pain worse. And they thought probably some, wavelengths are worse than others, except green, which cut the pain, which is a self-reported subjective score. But these migraineurs are sort of subjecting themselves in the interest of science to these painful wavelengths. Green came on. They said, wait a second, that feels good. University of Arizona did a follow-up study using practically green Christmas lights. They just bought these lights online. They were LEDs. They measured the wavelengths and they said, here's what we want you to do to their human subjects. Lock yourself in a dark closet. Plug in your Christmas lights and just sit there for an hour. And then keep a headache diary. Tell us how it goes. They got a significant reduction. I'm talking like 60 to 80% in the frequency and severity of migraine headaches. They've published 3 papers on this. So this paper comes into me and I call up a buddy who's in the red light business and I say, can you make me a green light? Just the same thing as your little red light, but I want green LEDs in there. He goes, I think I could, we'll see what prototype comes in. And he calls me up. He says, Tom, this is garbage. It's way too bright. And you can see, when I turn this on, you're like, nobody would want to stare at this thing. It's probably going to give you a headache. He says, I don't know what we're going to do. Those guys, who make my red lights, they're all about the power. And I asked them to tone it down. I said, it's okay. Me and AJ will be right out there. I got to see this for myself. And I agreed with them. I'm like, this is crap. But AJ says, let me see that thing. She takes it out of my hand and she puts it right up against her face with her eyes closed, Max. All the laboratory studies had been with the eyes open, asking the subjects to allow the green light to come in through their eyes and strike their retina. But this one's so bright. And AJ, when she has a migraine, she doesn't want to open her eyes anyway. So she closes her eyes, puts it right up here, and she goes, this feels really good. This is taking my headache from a 6 down to about a 2. I ordered 100 of them right away. I'm like, let's get these into the hands of other people. And since then, I've collected dozens of testimonies. These are sort of like product reviews. 80% of them sound like this. This is amazing. I can't believe it. I've been searching for this for my whole life. It's a miracle. I don't need my headache pain meds anymore. And that's not an exaggeration. This is coming from a chiropractor in Utah is using it with his patients. And these people are desperate for relief. Whether it is a post-concussion headache or a stress headache or a sinus headache or a migraine headache, they are getting relief. But 20% of the reports sound like this. At a certain time in my cycle, I get a headache. It's a migraine. It just won't quit. Green light cannot touch a high estrogen headache. And I didn't know this until people told me that. The other one is there's a type of migraine called vestibular. And I haven't had a lot of success with vestibular migraines. All the other headaches, the green light is taking the pain away. It won't necessarily take away the visual aura or the loss of proprioception or some other symptoms that migraineurs often have, but the pain goes away, and that's why it feels like a miracle. So I put that up. I read a couple articles, and everybody wants to know, what are the mechanisms? I have no idea. Rami Burstein at Harvard has no idea. The scientists at University of Arizona have no idea. All I have is sort of this evolutionary hypothesis, because if you go around the world measuring the dominant wavelengths of light in the shady forests, it doesn't matter what forest. You could be, in the Dominican Republic or Vermont or China. It's dominated by two wavelengths: green, which should be no surprise to anybody, and near infrared. These are the two things that happen in the forest. Well, where would our, ancient ancestors go when they're anxious? We know that one of the deepest, most visceral fears that comes out in people's nightmares is falling. And I've always thought that was because, we were up in the trees. I've always thought that the worst thing that can happen to us from this sort of brain stem point of view is falling out of the tree while we're asleep. When we're anxious, we go straight into the forest. And this is just a story. This isn't even a scientific hypothesis. There is something about green and those forest wavelengths of light that reduce pain, reduce stress, reduce anxiety. I don't even get headaches, but the days are short right now. So I get up in the morning, I use my green lantern. I turn it on right next to, I'm going to use my computer in dark mode, and I'm waking up, and it's okay to have a little blue light. It's okay to have a little green, but I'm getting the green into my eyes because I don't know, otherwise I might be a bundle full of stress. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, this is incredibly interesting. And you mentioned that near infrared and green are the predominant wavelengths in a forest. And that is because of the physiology of the leaves, which is the photosynthesizing leaf uses red and blue visible mostly, and it reflects massive amounts of green. That's why the leaf appears green, and it reflects a massive amount of near infrared. So that makes sense to me. I'm fascinated and intrigued about the possibility of light as a drug replacement therapy. I mean, I think that is the promise of photobiology and this idea of light as medicine, that all the way from UV up to past near infrared. So to hear that you've discovered and have now implemented a product based on that discovery is amazing to me. So well done. What wavelengths what exact wavelengths is this device emitting?
This is a little bit random. At Harvard, they used 320 nanometers, and then they couldn't get that exact wavelength at U of A. I think they were a little shorter.
Did you say 520 or 320?
No, 320.
320 is in the UVA range.
You are correct. I'm sorry.
It must be 520.
I'm pulling it up right now. What I put into my light is 530 and 545. And you are correct. The Harvard study was in the 500s, like 520. And then the University of Arizona was close, but it wasn't the exact same. When I looked at the spectrophotometer data from the forests, I noticed that the peak is higher than that. It's not at 520 where they, first discovered the result, but they never tested 550. They never tested 540. So I put two into this device, the 530 and the 545. So far, people have not reported a distinction. They haven't said, I like this wavelength better than that one. They just crank them all up and they use everything that they've got. That kind of makes sense to me. And then I used a US manufacturer. This is a medical device manufacturer in Salt Lake City. And I said, I want 4 different wavelengths and I want them on sliders. And I put them into ski goggles so that the patient could experiment with 4 different wavelengths at these changing intensities. We had to work out the flicker so that we were pretty careful on that. We didn't want to create a problem when we're trying to solve one. And so the less expensive model, which is imported from China, is just 2 wavelengths, 4 intensities in those, and we seem to be getting good results. But the research tool are these goggles that would allow people to fool around with the sliders and see if there's an optimum wavelength. It might not be the 545 to 550 that dominates the shady forest. It might be a little lower than that for reasons that I don't really understand. But the one time that I tested the red light and infrared on the back of a subject's head and the green in the front, I got a really good sort of subjective response from the subject. And then I said, now let's do it in the ice bath, because I'm going to add some stress. And this guy it was his second ice bath ever, so pretty naive to cold. He got in there and I set up my red on the back of his head and he held the green on the front. 6 minutes go by. no shivering, no urge to shiver. Like, what he reported was that the usual experience in the ice bath was different for him because the panic didn't set in. The usual shivering, which would seem like it's very healthy, right? Cold thermogenesis, didn't feel the urge. It's activated by the nervous system. It's possible that this combo was doing something to him that kept him relaxed in a way that he wouldn't otherwise have been. And now I want to write up an experimental protocol and see if other people report similar things.
Yeah, the idea of combining a device of green and near infrared to me sounds fascinating and potentially a possible option. The other thing that springs to mind is these transcranial photobiomodulation devices, and they're mostly in the red and the near infrared, and they've been using for everything from autism to traumatic brain injury to Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Really, it's Professor Mike Hamblin is the kind of lead researcher in this point of view. So I imagine if you made a device that was a transcranial helmet or a cap, potentially, what that would look like. But I guess that the wavelengths are shorter. So the green light is shorter wavelength, so it probably wouldn't penetrate anywhere near as deeply.
You are correct. Just like the short wavelengths of UV are so easily attenuated, whereas the long wavelengths will penetrate deeper into the body. Green is between the blue and the red, and it will penetrate more than blue, more than UV, but less than red. So it might not be able to reach the brain when you're going through the hair and the skull. But that optic nerve is a shortcut straight into the middle of the brain. And it's not like the light is traveling along the nerve. There is something happening in the back of the eye that is sending signals to the brain that subtract out the pain. I don't know if it's mitochondrial related, and I've always kind of doubted it. I do know that the retina is packed with mitochondria. Conversion of visible light into the signals, the sort of psychological interpretation of that light must be an incredibly energy-intensive process, because otherwise the retina cells wouldn't have so many mitochondria in them.
Yeah, exactly. And that's Glenn Jeffrey's work at UCL in London. And he's shown how mitochondrially packed the retina is and how beneficial 660 nanometers in the deep red can have for mitochondrial health. There's devices that are specifically using that. So I'm so glad to talk to you, Thomas, and to hear how